The air in the underground facility is thick with an electrical charge that makes the hair stand on end, and the stench of ozone mingles with something far worse, something organic and burning. In the center of the concrete bunker, suspended by heavy cables and glowing with an eerie violet luminescence, hangs a device shaped like a massive bell. It measures roughly 9 feet tall, and perhaps as many feet wide, its metallic surface rippling with an unnatural sheen that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. The device emits a low-frequency hum that vibrates through the chest cavity, making breathing difficult, making thinking nearly impossible. Around this bell-shaped object, men in thick protective suits stumble and convulse, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. One scientist clutches at his face mask, clawing desperately as if trying to tear it away from skin that has begun to blister beneath the rubber. Another has collapsed entirely, his body twitching in rhythmic spasms as blood seeps from beneath his suit. The humming grows louder, more insistent, and the violet glow intensifies until the shadows themselves seem to writhe and twist in ways that defy natural law. This is Die Glocke, the bell, and according to fragmentary reports and whispered accounts that emerged decades after the Second World War ended, this scene played out somewhere in the depths of Nazi-occupied Poland in 1944. But here is the question that haunts researchers and conspiracy theorists alike. The question that refuses to die even 79 years after the Reich fell. Did the Nazis actually create a weapon so terrible, so far beyond conventional understanding, that even its creators could not control it? More disturbing still, if such a device existed, where did it go when Germany collapsed? Who has it now? And what were they truly trying to achieve in those final desperate months of the war? The story of Die Glocke exists in that murky territory between documented history and modern legend, between declassified intelligence reports and fever dreams of secret weapons that could have changed everything. What we know for certain is frustratingly limited. What we suspect opens doors to possibilities that most mainstream historians refuse to even acknowledge. The Nazi regime, in its final years, poured enormous resources into experimental weapons programs, some conventional, others that pushed the boundaries of known science. Jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, nerve agents, these were real achievements born from that dark crucible. But what about the projects that went deeper, stranger, into territories that modern science still struggles to explain? Die Glocke first entered public consciousness in 2000, when a Polish journalist and researcher named Igor Witkowski published claims about the device based on his examination of classified documents and testimony he had allegedly received from a former German intelligence officer. According to these accounts, the bell was part of a program called Die Laternenträger, which translates roughly to the lantern bearers, though other sources connect it to something called Chronos, suggesting experiments with time itself. The device supposedly operated by counter-rotating 2 cylinders filled with a mysterious substance the Germans called Xerum 525, a violet-colored metallic liquid that might have been some form of mercury compound heavily enriched with thorium. When activated, the bell would spin these cylinders in opposite directions at tremendous speeds while subjected to extremely high voltages, creating effects that witnesses described as beyond anything in conventional physics. Those effects were lethal. According to the fragments of testimony that have emerged, the initial test runs of Die Glocke killed 5 of the 7 scientists in the first team assigned to the project. Their deaths were not clean or quick. Descriptions speak of tissues breaking down at the cellular level, of metabolic processes accelerating and then collapsing, of test subjects, both human and animal, literally coming apart as though the fundamental forces holding their bodies together had simply stopped functioning properly. Plants exposed to the device would decay into a gray crystalline substance within hours. Metals would develop strange properties, becoming brittle or displaying unusual magnetic characteristics. And the scientists who survived exposure often died within days or weeks, their bodies ravaged by what might have been extreme radiation poisoning. The location most frequently associated with Die Glocke is a facility known as Der Riese, the Giant, near the Wenceslaus mine in the Owl Mountains of Lower Silesia. This region, now part of Poland, was home to an extensive complex of underground installations built by the Nazis using concentration camp labor. Thousands died constructing these tunnels and bunkers, and to this day, much of the complex remains unexplored or classified. Near der Riese stands a curious concrete structure, a ring of pillars supporting nothing, thick reinforced pylons arranged in a circle, as if designed to hold something heavy, something that needed to be elevated and isolated from the ground. Some researchers believe this was the test stand for Die Glocke, though official explanations describe it as a cooling tower for conventional industrial equipment. What makes the bell more than just another wild tale of Nazi superweapons is the pattern of mysterious deaths and disappearances that surround its history. In the final weeks of the war, as Allied forces closed in from all sides, something happened at the experimental facilities in Silesia. According to testimony from local witnesses and later Soviet intelligence reports, SS execution squads systematically murdered dozens, perhaps hundreds, of scientists, technicians, and slave laborers associated with the most secret projects. These were not random killings, but targeted eliminations, as if someone wanted to ensure that specific knowledge died with specific people. Yet, curiously, the most senior scientists, those who would have understood the bell's underlying principles, vanished completely. They were not found dead. They were simply gone, along with any trace of the device itself. One name appears repeatedly in accounts of Die Glocke: General Hans Kammler, the SS officer who oversaw the Reich's most advanced weapons programs in the war's final stages. Kammler was responsible for the V-2 rocket program, for the construction of underground factories, and allegedly for the most exotic research projects that pushed into territories the Nazi leadership barely understood themselves. Kammler disappeared in May 1945, and his fate remains one of the unsolved mysteries of the war's end. Official records suggest he died near Prague, but no body was ever positively identified. Some researchers believe Kammler and a select group of scientists made it out of Germany, possibly to South America, possibly into American custody, carrying with them the secrets of technologies that would take decades to rediscover, if we have rediscovered them at all. So, what are we to make of Die Glocke? Is it real, or is it an elaborate myth constructed from fragments of genuine Nazi research, Cold War paranoia, and our collective fascination with secret weapons and lost technologies? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in that uncomfortable space between what we can prove and what the evidence suggests. We know the Nazis pursued experimental physics with desperate intensity in the war's final years. We know they investigated electromagnetic propulsion, particle physics, and theories that conventional science dismissed. We know that significant resources the dying Reich could barely afford, went into projects whose purpose remains unclear. And we know that in the chaos of Germany's collapse, technologies, documents, and people vanished in ways that intelligence agencies on both sides spent decades trying to unravel. The question is not whether every detail of the Die Glocke story is literally true. The question is what truth might be hidden within the legend. In the hours ahead, we will follow the trail of this mysterious device through declassified documents, scientific analysis, and the strange web of connections that link wartime Germany to unexplained phenomena reported decades later. We will examine the deaths, the disappearances, and the technologies that seem to echo the bell's alleged properties. We will ask whether something this strange, this dangerous, could truly have been built, and if so, whether it still exists somewhere, hidden in a government vault or a private collection, waiting to hum back to life. The journey leads through underground bunkers and classified archives, through theoretical physics and eyewitness testimony that seems too bizarre to believe yet too detailed to simply dismiss. Welcome to the mystery of Die Glocke, where history and horror merge, and where the line between what happened and what might still be happening grows dangerously thin. The winter of 1944 settled over the Third Reich like a burial shroud. In the frozen forests of Lower Silesia, near the border between Germany and occupied Poland, something extraordinary was taking shape beneath the earth. While Allied armies closed in from both east and west, while German cities burned under relentless bombing campaigns, the SS was pouring an incomprehensible fortune into a project so secret that even most high-ranking Nazi officials knew nothing of its existence. This was the era of the Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapons that Hitler and his inner circle believed would turn the tide of an unwinnable war. Desperation had seized the Nazi leadership like a fever. The V-2 rockets were raining down on London, jet aircraft were being rushed into production, and in laboratories across the crumbling Reich, scientists worked on everything from sound cannons to death rays. But among all these frantic attempts to conjure salvation from the laws of physics, one project stood apart. Its code name was Die Glocke, the bell. The story begins in the labyrinthine tunnels beneath the Wenceslaus mine, a sprawling complex in the Owl Mountains of Lower Silesia, near the town of Ludwikowice in modern-day Poland. This was not some hastily constructed bunker. The facility that would house Die Glocke represented an engineering marvel that consumed thousands of slave laborers, many of whom never emerged from those dark passages. The mine itself had existed for centuries, but what the SS constructed there in 1944 bore no resemblance to any mining operation. Massive concrete structures rose underground, their walls reinforced to thicknesses that seemed designed to contain something far more dangerous than mere industrial processes. The man tasked with overseeing this sprawling empire of secrecy was Obergruppenführer Jakob Sporenberg, a figure whose very presence seemed to embody the darkest aspects of Nazi fanaticism. Sporenberg was no scientist, no visionary thinker. He was an enforcer, a man who had proven his loyalty to the regime through unspeakable acts in occupied territories. His role at the Wenceslaus facility tells us something crucial about Die Glocke. Whatever was happening in those underground chambers required not just scientific expertise, but absolute, ruthless control. Sporenberg's specialty was making problems disappear, ensuring silence, and eliminating anyone who might compromise operational security. That such a man commanded the project speaks volumes about what the SS feared might happen if word of Die Glocke escaped into the world. Working under Sporenberg's watchful eye was a team of scientists led by physicist Walter Gerlach, a respected researcher who had made genuine contributions to quantum mechanics before the war consumed everything. Gerlach's involvement remains one of the most troubling aspects of the Die Glocke legend. Here was a man trained in the rigorous traditions of German scientific inquiry, someone who understood the difference between theoretical possibility and fantastical speculation. Yet according to post-war testimonies, he directed his considerable intellect toward a goal that seemed to exist at the bleeding edge between physics and something altogether stranger. The resources devoted to Die Glocke defy rational explanation, especially for a nation facing imminent collapse. Witness accounts and fragmentary documentation suggest that the project consumed materials that were desperately needed elsewhere. Enormous quantities of electrical equipment, rare metals, and substances that remain mysterious even today were channeled into the facility. We know that the device required massive amounts of electrical power, far more than could be explained by any conventional research apparatus of the era. Dedicated power stations were constructed to feed the bell's insatiable hunger for energy. In a Germany where every drop of fuel and every scrap of metal should have gone toward defending against the Allied advance, this single project was granted virtually unlimited resources. But what exactly was Die Glocke designed to do? Here, the historical record fractures into competing theories, witness testimonies that contradict each other, and claims that sound more like science fiction than documented fact. The most persistent accounts describe the bell as a device roughly 9 feet wide and 12 to 15 feet high, shaped like its namesake. Its exterior was composed of a hard, heavy metal that witnesses described as ceramic-like in appearance. Within this shell sat 2 counter-rotating cylinders that contained a mysterious substance the Germans called Xerum 525. This material, Xerum 525, haunts every discussion of Die Glocke. Descriptions vary, but most accounts agree it was a metallic liquid, violet or purple in color, that exhibited properties unlike anything in the known periodic table. Some researchers have speculated it might have been a form of red mercury, a substance that itself straddles the line between Cold War legend and possible reality. Others suggest it could have been an isotope of mercury mixed with other exotic compounds. What seems consistent across the fragmentary accounts is that this substance was both incredibly rare and incredibly dangerous. The scientists and technicians who worked directly with it paid a terrible price, as we shall see. When activated, Die Glocke supposedly generated effects that seemed to violate fundamental laws of physics. The counter-rotating cylinders would spin at tremendous speeds while subjected to massive electrical charges. Witnesses claimed that during these tests, a pale blue glow would emanate from the device, accompanied by a high-pitched whining sound that set teeth on edge and sent vibrations through the concrete floors. But these sensory phenomena were just the beginning. According to testimonies, the space around Die Glocke would become distorted. Test subjects, biological materials, and equipment placed in the vicinity would undergo bizarre transformations. The official purpose of the project remains disputed. Some accounts claim Die Glocke was intended as an anti-gravity propulsion system, a way to create aircraft that could hover and maneuver in ways that would make them invulnerable to conventional defenses. The Nazi leadership's obsession with flying saucers and unconventional aircraft designs is well documented. Multiple prototype disc-shaped aircraft were tested during the war years, though none achieved the performance characteristics attributed to Die Glocke. If the Bell truly could manipulate gravity, it would represent not just a wonder weapon but a fundamental breakthrough in physics that would reshape human civilization. Other theories paint an even darker picture. Some researchers believe Die Glocke was designed to manipulate time itself, creating localized distortions in the space-time continuum. This sounds absurd until one considers that serious physicists in the 1940s were already grappling with the theoretical implications of Einstein's relativity. The possibility of time dilation, of creating regions where time moved at different rates, existed within the mathematical frameworks that German scientists understood. Whether it could be achieved with 1940s technology is another question entirely, but the desperation of the Nazi regime makes such an attempt at least conceivable. Then there are the most sinister theories, whispered accounts that Die Glocke was something else entirely. A weapon that could age targets to death within seconds. A portal to other dimensions. A means of communicating with entities or forces that existed outside normal reality. These claims push into territory where history bleeds into horror, where the documented evil of the Nazi regime mingles with something that feels almost supernatural in its malevolence. What we do know with greater certainty is that Die Glocke killed people. The scientists and technicians directly involved in testing the device suffered horrific fates. Accounts describe researchers who developed lesions on their skin, whose blood coagulated in their veins, whose cellular structure seemed to break down at a fundamental level. Plants and animals subjected to the Bell's influence during tests reportedly crystallized, their organic tissues transforming into brittle, glassy substances. 5 of the scientists involved in the early testing phase died under mysterious circumstances that the official records attributed to various causes, but that survivors later claimed were direct results of exposure to the device. The secrecy surrounding Die Glocke went beyond typical military classification. Workers who constructed the underground facility were reportedly executed after completing their tasks, ensuring their knowledge died with them. Documentation was deliberately fragmented, with different teams working on isolated components without understanding the larger whole. Even within the SS hierarchy, information about the project was compartmentalized to an extreme degree. This wasn't just about protecting military secrets from enemy intelligence. This was about hiding something that the Nazi leadership itself feared, something so dangerous or so controversial that even friendly eyes could not be allowed to see it. As the Reich entered its final death throes in early 1945, Die Glocke vanished. The facility was hastily evacuated, with evidence suggesting a deliberate attempt to destroy or conceal evidence of what had transpired there. SS General Jakob Sporenberg would later be captured and tried, not for his involvement with Die Glocke, but for war crimes committed in occupied Poland. During his interrogation and trial, he made cryptic references to secret projects and advanced research, but the full details of his knowledge died with him when he was executed in 1952. The fate of the Bell itself remains unknown. Some believe it was destroyed by retreating SS forces who wanted to prevent it from falling into Soviet or American hands. Others claim it was evacuated, spirited away in the final chaotic weeks of the war to locations ranging from South America to Antarctica to secret bases that may have been prepared in advance for precisely such contingencies. The most provocative theory suggests that Die Glocke was successfully tested, that it worked, and that its creators used it to escape the collapsing Reich by means we can barely imagine. In the decades since the war's end, the Wenceslas mine facility has been explored by researchers, tourists, and curiosity seekers. The massive concrete structures remain, their purpose still debated. Scorch marks on walls, strange residues, and the sheer scale of the construction continue to fuel speculation. The site known as the Henge, a concrete structure resembling a test stand for something large and heavy, sits abandoned in the forest nearby, its origins officially uncertain, but its design consistent with accounts of Die Glocke testing apparatus. The metal door sealed behind them with a sound like a coffin closing, and the 7 scientists took their positions around the device they had come to call Die Glocke. It was early December of 1944, deep in the tunnels beneath the Wenceslas mine in Lower Silesia, and none of them could have imagined they had just hours to live. According to interrogation transcripts obtained after the war, the device hummed to life with a frequency that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and vibrate directly in the bones. The bell stood approximately 9 feet tall, its ceramic casing reinforced with a strange composite material that no one outside the project had clearance to examine. Inside its rotating drums, 2 counter-rotating cylinders spun a mercury-like substance the scientists referred to only by its code name, Xerum 525. The substance itself had an odd violet tint when exposed to light, though most of the time it remained hidden within the double-walled chamber at the device's core. The test chamber had been prepared according to the most recent safety protocols, though these would prove catastrophically inadequate. Lead-lined aprons hung heavy on the scientists' frames. Thick rubber gloves encased their hands. Face shields of darkened glass obscured their features. But none of this would matter. Whatever force the bell unleashed did not respect the conventional barriers that stopped radiation or chemical exposure. When the activation sequence began, witnesses in the observation room reported that the distinctive purple glow started almost immediately. It did not emanate from any single point, but seemed to fill the chamber like liquid light, pooling in corners and seeping through the air itself. The glow pulsed in rhythm with the device's rotation, growing more intense with each cycle. Through the thick observation glass, those watching said it looked like standing at the bottom of a vast ocean, looking up through fathoms of violet water toward a sun that should not exist. Within the first 3 minutes, the metallic taste began. Dr. Heinrich Arnsberg, the senior physicist on the project, was the first to report it according to the transcripts. He described it as similar to having a copper coin pressed against the tongue, but deeper somehow, as if the taste originated not from the mouth but from somewhere further inside the body. Within 60 seconds, all 7 scientists reported the same sensation. One compared it to licking a battery. Another said it tasted like blood and iron mixed together, a flavor both familiar and deeply wrong. The vertigo came next, sudden and overwhelming. Dr. Arnsberg later described it in the brief testimony given before his condition deteriorated beyond speech. He said the floor seemed to tilt beneath his feet, though his eyes told him it remained level. His inner ear reported impossible movements, rotations in directions that should not exist. One of the junior researchers, a physicist named Klaus Meinhof, fell to his knees almost immediately. Through the observation window, the witnesses saw him clutching his head, mouth open in what might have been a scream, though the thick walls prevented any sound from escaping. Then the convulsions started. Dr. Arnsberg's hands began to shake first, small tremors that rapidly escalated into violent spasms. His arms jerked at odd angles, muscles contracting with such force that several witnesses reported hearing the snap of breaking bones even through the reinforced glass. The movements were not random but seemed to follow some terrible pattern, as if his body was responding to forces the observers could not detect. His colleagues fared no better. Within 5 minutes of activation, all 7 scientists were on the floor, bodies twisting in synchronized agony. The skin changes happened faster than anyone watching could fully comprehend. The interrogation transcripts describe it in clinical detail, though the horror bleeds through the formal language. The scientists' skin began to lose color, not gradually, but in waves that spread from their extremities inward toward their cores. But this was not the simple pallor of someone who has lost blood. The skin took on a gray tone that witnesses consistently described as metallic, almost like pewter or tarnished silver. It had a waxy quality, as if the flesh beneath had fundamentally changed in composition. Beneath this graying skin, the blood was failing. The coagulation began in the peripheral vessels, according to the medical officers who examined the bodies afterward. Small capillaries in the fingers and toes clotted first, creating dark patterns beneath the graying skin, like terrible maps. But the clotting spread inward with shocking speed, moving through larger vessels, creating blockages that should have killed through stroke or heart attack, but somehow did not. The victims remained alive, conscious, aware of what was happening to them. The most horrifying detail emerged only after medical examination, though some witnesses claimed they could see it happening through the observation glass. The tissue itself was decomposing, not in the manner of post-mortem decay, but through some accelerated process that occurred in living flesh. The cellular structures were breaking down at a molecular level, the bonds that held organic matter together simply dissolving. Muscle fibers separated, connective tissue liquefied, organs began to soften and collapse. And through it all, the victims remained alive, their nervous systems still firing, still sending signals of unimaginable pain to brains that were themselves beginning to fail. The crystallization of bodily fluids remains one of the most inexplicable aspects of the incident. When the medical team entered the chamber after the emergency shutdown, they found that fluids had leaked from the victims' eyes, noses, and ears. These fluids had formed strange crystalline structures on the chamber floor, geometric patterns that should not be possible from organic liquids. The crystals were violet in color, the same shade as the glow from the bell. When collected for analysis, they dissolved within hours, leaving only faint stains that smelled of ozone and something else, something the technicians could not identify. The smell itself became legendary among those who survived that day. It permeated the test chamber despite all ventilation systems running at maximum capacity. Witnesses described it as acrid, like burning metal mixed with decomposing organic matter. But there were other notes too, scents that seemed to bypass normal olfactory processing and trigger deep, primal revulsion. One guard who helped with the cleanup said it smelled like what he imagined a lightning strike would smell like if it hit living flesh. Another said it reminded him of a slaughterhouse, but wrong somehow, as if the meat being processed was from something that should not exist. The timeline from activation to death varied slightly among the 7 victims, but all were dead within 45 minutes. The longest to survive was Dr. Arnsberg himself, who remained conscious almost until the end. His final words, recorded by a guard who stayed close to the observation window, were transcribed in the interrogation documents. He said the device was not spinning. He said it was falling through something, pulling the space around it inward, and they had fallen with it. Then his speech dissolved into sounds that were no longer quite human. The disposal of the bodies began immediately. Orders came down from the highest levels of the SS hierarchy. The corpses could not be processed through normal channels. They could not be returned to families. They could not even be buried in marked graves. The tissue degradation continued even after death, the bodies continuing to liquefy and crystallize in alternating cycles. Special containers had to be constructed, lead-lined drums sealed with welding equipment normally used for submarine. Even then, the guards who transported the drums reported that strange sounds came from within, crackling and hissing like electrical discharges in wet air. The protective measures were immediately revised, though the revisions were based more on desperation than understanding. The lead-lined aprons were doubled in thickness. The observation distance was increased. Exposure time was limited to 3-minute intervals with full decontamination protocols between exposures. But none of the researchers truly understood what they were protecting against. The bell did not emit conventional radiation, at least not primarily. It did something else, something that affected matter and energy in ways that their physics could not explain. Subsequent tests with animals confirmed the pattern. Mice died within seconds, their small bodies unable to withstand whatever force the bell generated. Larger animals lasted longer but showed the same progression of symptoms. The metallic taste, measured by behavioral responses. The vertigo, evident in their loss of coordination. The convulsions, the graying skin, the tissue decomposition, all of it repeating with horrible consistency. The purple glow became a harbinger of death. Workers in the facility developed superstitions around it. They would not look directly at the light when it appeared. Some claim that those who stared too long into the violet luminescence began to see things, shapes moving in the glow that should not be there. Others reported dreams in the nights following exposure, dreams of falling through geometric spaces that hurt to perceive. The incident was classified at the highest levels, buried under layers of secrecy that the Reich's collapse would only deepen. But the testimony survived, preserved in interrogation transcripts and scattered documents that surfaced decades later. The 7 scientists who died that December day became nameless casualties in files marked with security classifications that outlasted the government that created them. Their families were told they died serving the fatherland, nothing more. The true nature of their deaths remained sealed in vaults and locked filing cabinets, another terrible secret of a project that generated more questions than answers, more horror than understanding. Deep in the mountains of Lower Silesia, workers in striped uniforms carried cylinders that were never supposed to touch human skin. The containers were heavy, lined with lead thick enough to stop most forms of radiation, and sealed with elaborate mechanisms that suggested whatever lay inside was valuable beyond measure or dangerous beyond comprehension. Perhaps it was both. The substance inside these cylinders bore the designation Xerum 525, and according to those who survived handling it, this material defied every law of physics and chemistry they thought they understood. The first witness accounts emerged from a Polish prisoner named Jakub Sporenberg, though his name appears in records with various spellings that suggest either deliberate obfuscation or the chaos of post-war documentation. He worked in the lower chambers of the Wenceslas mine, where the deeper you descended, the stranger the work became. Sporenberg claimed that Xerum 525 arrived at the facility in containers, marked with symbols he did not recognize, accompanied by SS officers who wore special protective gear even when the cylinders remained sealed. The workers who unloaded these shipments wore no such protection. Within 3 weeks of the first delivery, 6 men from his work detail were dead. The substance itself appeared metallic, flowing like mercury, but possessing a color that Sporenberg struggled to describe in his testimony. He used the word violet, but qualified it, saying the color seemed wrong somehow, as if his eyes were not properly equipped to process what they were seeing. Other witnesses employed similarly uncertain language. One described it as purple twilight given physical form. Another said it looked like liquid that had somehow caught fire without burning. A third witness, a Czech engineer who had studied chemistry before the war, stated flatly that the color did not exist on any spectrum he had been taught. What made Xerum 525 particularly unsettling was its apparent ability to exist in multiple states simultaneously. Scientific orthodoxy maintains that matter exists as solid, liquid, or gas, with plasma representing a fourth state under extreme conditions. Yet workers who observed this substance through the thick glass viewing ports described something that appeared to flow like liquid while maintaining crystalline structures within itself, structures that formed, dissolved, and reformed in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. One witness report, buried in Soviet archives until 1991, described the material as thinking liquid, a phrase that sounds absurd until you read the full context of the observation. The procurement of Xerum 525 remains one of the deepest mysteries surrounding Die Glocke project. No conventional supplier could produce a substance with these properties, assuming the descriptions were accurate. Some researchers have suggested the material came from Germany's chemical industry, perhaps from E.G. Farben facilities that were conducting experiments at the edges of accepted science. Others point to the Reich's extensive mineral exploration programs in occupied territories, particularly in Czechoslovakia and Poland, where mining operations sometimes uncovered deposits that seemed to predate any known geological processes. One theory that gained traction among post-war investigators involved thorium, a radioactive element that was relatively abundant and being explored for various applications in the 1930s and early 1940s. Thorium compounds could explain some of the properties attributed to Xerum 525, particularly its apparent radioactivity and the devastating effects on biological tissue. However, thorium alone could not account for the violet luminescence or the bizarre multi-state existence witnesses describe. Some have suggested thorium mixed with mercury, creating a compound that amplified the properties of both elements into something unprecedented. The red mercury theory emerged later, during the Cold War, when rumors circulated about an exotic material supposedly developed by Soviet scientists. Red mercury was described as a substance that could facilitate nuclear reactions, serve as a powerful explosive, or enable weapons technologies that conventional physics claimed were impossible. Most mainstream scientists dismissed red mercury as fantasy, a phantom material that existed only in paranoid imagination and black market fraud. Yet the descriptions of red mercury bore an unsettling resemblance to the earlier accounts of Xerum 525, similar enough to make some researchers wonder if both stories originated from the same source. What remains undeniable, documented in multiple independent testimonies and corroborated by medical records from liberated camps, is that exposure to Xerum 525 caused catastrophic cellular breakdown in living tissue. Workers who came into direct contact with the substance, even through brief skin exposure, developed symptoms that progressed with horrifying speed. The initial sign was a burning sensation that victims described as feeling both freezing cold and searingly hot simultaneously. Within hours, the skin at the contact site would develop lesions that resembled severe radiation burns. Within days, the damage would spread systemically, as if the substance had rewritten the basic instructions that held cells together. A Polish doctor who treated several of these victims after the war described the cellular damage as unlike anything in his medical experience. The cells did not simply die, he noted. They appeared to be transforming into something else. Something that his microscope showed him but his training could not explain. He used the word dissolution, but clarified that this was inadequate. The boundaries between cells became permeable, he testified, as if the material had convinced them they did not need to maintain separate identity. The procurement chain for Xerum 525 required coordination at the highest levels of the Nazi state. Transportation records, fragmentary as they are, indicate shipments originating from facilities in central Germany and traveling under armed guard to the Wenceslas complex. The quantities were substantial enough to require multiple railcars, yet small enough to suggest this was rare material, difficult to produce or extract. Some researchers have traced potential connections to the Auer Company, which worked extensively with rare earth elements and radioactive materials, supplying gas mantles and other products that required thorium and similar substances. The storage protocols for Xerum 525 reveal an organization that understood they were handling something extraordinarily dangerous. The lead-lined cylinders were just the first layer of protection. These containers were kept in specially constructed chambers carved from solid rock, rooms that workers were instructed to enter only with authorization from SS command. Ventilation in these storage areas followed unusual patterns, with air being pumped out and filtered through systems that, according to one engineer's account, seemed designed to capture not just particles or vapor, but something more subtle, something he described as the presence of the material. Slave laborers who worked in proximity to Xerum 525 faced mortality rates that were extraordinary, even by the standards of Nazi forced labor camps. In facilities where death from malnutrition, disease, and violence claimed approximately 30% of workers annually, the units handling the violet substance saw attrition rates exceeding 70%. These workers did not simply die faster. They died in ways that terrified even the SS guards, developing symptoms that suggested their basic biology was being rewritten at the molecular level. One account, provided by a Ukrainian prisoner who survived the war, described a co-worker who had splashed a small amount of the substance on his hand. The man had been wearing cloth gloves, not nearly sufficient protection, and a quantity smaller than a teaspoon made contact with his skin. He washed immediately in the decontamination station, scrubbing until his hand was raw. It made no difference. By the next morning, his hand had swollen to twice its normal size and turned a color the witness described as black violet. By evening, he could no longer move his fingers. 3 days later, he was dead, and his body was removed so quickly that the other workers never saw what had become of him. The few scientists who were familiar with Xerum 525 and survived the war proved remarkably reluctant to discuss it. Some claimed complete ignorance when questioned by Allied investigators. Others provided technical descriptions so vague as to be meaningless, speaking of novel compounds and experimental formulations without specifying anything concrete. A chemist who worked peripherally on the project told American interrogators that Xerum 525 was simply a code name for a mercury compound, nothing exotic, nothing unusual. Yet when pressed for details about the specific formulation, he became evasive, eventually stating that all records had been destroyed and his memory was unreliable. The most disturbing aspect of the Xerum 525 mystery may be the suggestion, present in several witness accounts, that the substance exhibited properties that could only be described as responsive. Workers reported that the material seemed to react to proximity to living tissue, that its luminescence would intensify when someone approached the storage containers, that the patterns within it would accelerate and become more complex. One witness claimed that during an accident, when a container seal failed, the substance flowed upward, defying gravity, moving toward the workers in the room as if aware of their presence. Modern attempts to identify Xerum 525 have produced only speculation. Without physical samples, we are left with testimonies that describe a material that may have been exotic chemistry, misunderstood physics, or something that genuinely fell outside the boundaries of conventional science. The violet glow suggests possible mercury vapor lamps or certain radioactive compounds. The multi-state properties might indicate a colloid or exotic plasma. The biological effects align with severe radiation exposure or contact with highly reactive chemical agents. Yet none of these explanations fully account for the totality of what witnesses describe. What remains, beyond the theories and the fragmentary evidence, is a pattern of death. Hundreds of slave laborers died procuring, transporting, and handling a substance that may have powered one of the Third Reich's most secret projects. They died without understanding what they were touching. They died without protection or care. They died in ways that suggested they had encountered something that treated human tissue as infinitely malleable, as raw material to be restructured according to laws they could not comprehend. Whether Xerum 525 was breakthrough science, dangerous delusion, or something genuinely unknown, it left a trail of destroyed bodies that testified to its power. The violet glow that witnesses described may have been merely light, but in the darkness of those underground chambers, it must have seemed like the color of their approaching deaths. Deep in the scrublands outside the abandoned Wenceslaus mine, there stands a monument to something that should not exist. Locals call it the Henge, though it bears little resemblance to its ancient British namesake. This is no arrangement of weathered stone transported by unknown means across a primordial landscape. This is concrete and steel, poured and reinforced with modern materials, yet built according to a design that defies conventional engineering logic. The structure consists of 12 massive pillars arranged in a perfect circle, each one rising approximately 15 feet from the desert floor. The diameter of the circle measures exactly 60 feet across, a dimension that seems purposeful, calculated for a specific function that remains maddeningly unclear. But it is not the arrangement that captures the attention of those who venture to this forsaken place. It is the pillars themselves. Each column is constructed from reinforced concrete, poured around a core of steel rebar that would be more at home supporting a suspension bridge than standing isolated in the desert. The concrete itself is unusual, mixed with an aggregate that includes what appears to be crushed volcanic rock, despite no volcanic activity having occurred in this region for millions of years. Engineers who have examined the structure estimate that each pillar could support upward of 200 tons of weight. Together, the 12 columns could theoretically bear thousands of tons of downward pressure. But bear the weight of what? That is the question that haunts every investigator who has studied the Henge. The tops of the pillars show clear evidence of attachment points, deep grooves worn into the concrete, as if massive chains or cables were once anchored there, pulling downward with tremendous force over an extended period. Some of these grooves cut nearly 6 inches into the reinforced concrete, suggesting tensions that would have been measured in the hundreds of thousands of pounds. More disturbing still are the chains that remain, embedded directly into the concrete itself. These are not the kind of chains you would use to secure a gate or tether livestock. These are industrial-grade restraints, each link forged from steel nearly 2 inches thick. They emerge from the concrete at irregular intervals around the base of several pillars, as if they were set into the wet mixture during the original pour. Most extend only a few feet, before ending in twisted, melted terminations that suggest exposure to heat intense enough to liquefy steel. The melting point of steel is approximately 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. Whatever happened at the Henge generated temperatures that exceeded this threshold. The ground surrounding the structure tells its own disturbing story. In 1998, a team from the Environmental Protection Agency conducted soil surveys in the area as part of a broader investigation into contamination from abandoned mining operations. What they found near the Henge had nothing to do with conventional mining pollution. The soil samples revealed the presence of isotopes that do not occur in nature. Cesium-137 and strontium-90, both byproducts of nuclear fission, were present in concentrations significant enough to trigger federal reporting requirements. But these were not the only anomalies. The soil also contained traces of elements with isotopic signatures that matched no known natural process. One researcher described finding an isotope of europium with a half-life that suggested it had been created, not extracted. Created by what process, and for what purpose, remained unanswered questions. The contamination extends outward from the Henge in a roughly circular pattern, gradually diminishing with distance but remaining detectable for nearly a quarter mile in all directions. This dead zone, as locals have come to call it, exhibits characteristics that cannot be fully explained by the presence of radioactive isotopes alone. The soil chemistry has been fundamentally altered, its pH levels pushed far outside the range that typically supports plant life. Heavy metals are present in concentrations that would be considered catastrophic by any environmental standard, yet their distribution pattern suggests they were not deposited gradually over time, but introduced in a single catastrophic event. Nothing grows properly within the dead zone. Those plants that do manage to take root emerge stunted and malformed, their leaves yellowed and twisted, their growth patterns defying normal botanical development. Juniper trees that should reach heights of 20 feet or more struggle to achieve 4 or 5 feet, their trunks gnarled and their branches reaching out at unnatural angles. Sagebrush, normally so hardy it thrives in the harshest desert conditions, grows in sparse, irregular patches, each plant separated from its neighbors by expanses of bare soil. Local ranchers learned long ago to avoid grazing their cattle anywhere near the Henge. The animals, they say, will not enter the dead zone willingly. Horses approaching the area become skittish and resistant, pulling against their reins and whinnying in distress. Dogs, normally eager to explore new territory, stop at what appears to be an invisible boundary and refuse to proceed further, hackles raised and eyes fixed on the concrete pillars in the distance. Some animals that have been forced into the area or wandered in by accident reportedly emerged showing signs of extreme stress, panting heavily, eyes wide with what witnesses described as fear. Margaret Holloway has lived within sight of the Henge for 47 years. Her ranch lies approximately 2 miles from the structure, close enough that on clear days she can see the tops of the pillars rising above the desert scrub. She tells a story about a calf that wandered into the dead zone in the summer of 2003. The animal was found 3 days later, standing motionless near the base of one of the pillars. When ranch hands approached to retrieve it, they found the calf alive but unresponsive, staring blankly ahead. The animal refused food and water. Within a week, despite showing no signs of injury or disease, it died. The veterinarian who examined the carcass could find no cause of death. Stories like this circulate among the local population with a frequency that suggests they are more than mere folklore. Tom Bradshaw, who operates a hunting guide service in the region, claims that deer populations avoid the dead zone entirely, creating what amounts to a perfect circle of absence in the local ecosystem. Trail cameras set up to monitor wildlife activity have captured thousands of images of deer, coyotes, and other animals in the surrounding area, but none within 500 feet of the Henge. Birds, too, seem to recognize some invisible danger. They circle overhead, but rarely land within the contaminated zone. The physical evidence preserved in the concrete itself raises questions that no investigation has adequately answered. Scorch marks scar the interior faces of several pillars, black streaks that rise from ground level to heights of 8 or 9 feet. Analysis of these marks has proven inconclusive. They are not the result of conventional fire. The pattern of damage suggests exposure to intense heat directed from a central point within the circle, radiating outward toward the pillars. The concrete in these scorched areas has been altered at a molecular level, its crystalline structure changed in ways that typically require sustained exposure to temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. In some locations, the surface of the concrete has vitrified, transformed into a glass-like substance that reflects light with an oily sheen. Vitrification of concrete generally occurs only under extraordinary circumstances, such as direct exposure to lightning strikes or close proximity to explosive detonations. Yet there is no evidence of explosives having been used at the Henge, no crater indicative of a blast, no fragmentation patterns consistent with bombing or demolition. The vitrification appears to have resulted from an energy discharge of unknown origin and unprecedented intensity. More puzzling still are the geometric patterns visible in some of the scorch marks. These are not random burns, but organized arrays of lines and curves that suggest deliberate intent or at least a structured energy field. One pattern resembles a spiral, winding outward from a central point with mathematical precision. Another forms what appears to be a series of concentric circles, each ring slightly offset from its neighbors. Researchers who have studied these patterns note their similarity to electromagnetic field visualizations, the kind of images produced when iron filings are scattered across a surface above a powerful magnet. The question of who built the Henge and when remains frustratingly unresolved. The concrete shows weathering consistent with several decades of exposure to the elements, suggesting construction sometime between the 1960s and 1980s. Yet no building permits exist for the structure. No construction contracts have been found in local or federal archives. The land on which the Henge stands has passed through several ownerships over the past 50 years, but none of the property owners claim knowledge of the structure's origins. It simply exists, unexplained and unauthorized. Some investigators have theorized that the Henge was built by the military as part of a classified research program. The nearby Wenslaus mine had connections to government operations during the Cold War, and the remote location would have provided the kind of isolation necessary for sensitive experiments. This theory would explain the sophisticated engineering and the presence of exotic isotopes. It would account for the absence of documentation and the reluctance of officials to discuss the site. But it does not explain what was being tested or why the facility was apparently abandoned in such haste that massive chains were left embedded in the concrete. Others suggest a connection to the nuclear industry, perhaps an unauthorized disposal site for radioactive materials or a testing ground for containment technologies. The isotopic signature of the soil contamination supports this interpretation to some degree. Yet the configuration of the pillars, designed to support enormous weight from above rather than contain material below, argues against a simple storage or burial function. Whatever the Henge was built to do, it involved suspending or restraining something massive, something that generated tremendous heat and left behind contamination that persists decades later. The local population has developed its own explanations, stories that blend observed phenomena with darker speculation. Some say the Henge was built to contain something that escaped, that the melted chains and scorch marks are evidence of a catastrophic failure. Others whisper about experiments that went wrong, about energy sources that could not be controlled, about the night the sky over the dead zone glowed with a light that was not fire and was not lightning. These stories cannot be verified, but they persist with the kind of conviction that comes from collective trauma. What remains undeniable is the physical evidence itself. The Henge stands as a monument to human ambition pursued beyond reasonable limits, to experiments conducted in isolation without adequate safeguards, or perhaps without adequate understanding of the forces being manipulated. The contaminated soil, the dead zone, the fleeing animals all testify to consequences that cannot be undone. Whatever happened in that circle of concrete pillars, the land remembers, and the land, in its own way, warns those who would approach to turn back, to leave this place to its silence and its secrets. The cold April air of 1945 carried the scent of cordite and desperation across the pine forests of Lower Silesia. Soviet tanks were grinding westward, their treads churning the muddy roads into rivers of earth, and the Third Reich was bleeding out its final days. In the underground complexes beneath the Wenslaus mine, Engineers worked with a feverish intensity that transcended mere duty. They were racing against time itself, dismantling something the world was never supposed to see. Die Glocke, the bell, had been the Reich's darkest technological secret. For months, it had hummed with an otherworldly power in its test chamber. Suspended between concrete pillars that bore the scars of forces no conventional physics could explain. Now, as the thunder of Soviet artillery grew louder each day, SS General Jakob Sporenberg faced an impossible task. He had to make the bell disappear, and he had to ensure that its secrets died with those who knew them best. The decision was made in a conference room deep underground, far from the spring sunshine that was beginning to warm the surface world. Sporenberg was a career SS officer, a man who had climbed the ranks through unwavering obedience and a willingness to execute orders that would have broken lesser men. What happened next would earn him a place in history's darkest corners, though the full details would remain buried in classified files for decades to come. On a morning in late April, 62 men gathered in what they believed was a routine assembly. They were scientists, technicians, engineers, the very minds that had brought Die Glocke from theoretical impossibility to humming reality. Some were physicists who understood the quantum mechanics underlying the bell's operation. Others were metallurgists who had solved the seemingly impossible problem of containing the device's exotic reactions. There were electrical engineers who had wired the massive power systems, and machinists who had manufactured components to tolerances measured in thousandths of a millimeter. They stood in the cool morning air, perhaps wondering why they had been called from their evacuation preparations. Some likely felt relief, thinking this assembly meant transportation had been arranged for their families. Others, the more perceptive ones, might have noticed the unusual number of armed guards surrounding them, or the absence of the senior scientists who had already been evacuated westward. What happened next took perhaps 10 minutes. The execution was methodical, efficient, conducted with the cold precision that characterized so much of the SS methodology. 62 men who had pushed the boundaries of science into realms that still remain classified today were murdered to protect a secret. Their bodies were disposed of in a manner designed to prevent identification, buried in unmarked graves that the advancing Soviets would never connect to the underground complex nearby. This mass murder was not an act of panic or rage. It was calculated, planned, approved at the highest levels of the remaining Nazi command structure. Every one of these men represented a potential security breach. In Soviet hands, under interrogation, even the most patriotic among them might reveal details about Die Glocke. And so they were eliminated, their knowledge erased, their families left to wonder what had happened in those final chaotic days. Sporenberg himself would survive the war, only to be captured and tried for war crimes. During his interrogation, he spoke carefully about the Bell project, revealing just enough to tantalize investigators while maintaining that the device had been destroyed. He mentioned the executions almost casually, as if the murder of 62 civilians was merely an administrative detail in the greater collapse of the Reich. His testimony, preserved in Polish military archives, provides one of the few direct confirmations that Die Glocke actually existed. But while Sporenberg talked of destruction, the evidence suggests something far different. In the weeks before the executions, witnesses reported unusual activity at the Wenceslas mine. Heavy trucks arrived under cover of darkness, their engines straining against loads that made their suspension groan. Railway cars appeared on sidings that had supposedly been abandoned, guarded by SS troops who turned away even high-ranking Wehrmacht officers. The bell itself was no small object. Estimates based on the few surviving descriptions suggest it weighed several tons, possibly as much as 5 or 6 tons fully assembled. Moving such an object in the chaos of a collapsing front was no simple matter. It would have required specialized equipment, heavy-duty transport vehicles, and most critically, a destination secure enough to receive such a cargo. Declassified documents from the period revealed tantalizing gaps in transportation records. An American intelligence report from May 1945 notes the arrival of heavy equipment from Poland at an airfield in Bavaria, equipment whose origin and purpose were never satisfactorily explained. The manifest listed the cargo as industrial machinery, but the weight and handling requirements suggest something far more specialized. Other evidence points to a maritime route. The German submarine U-534 left Norway in early May 1945, just days before the German surrender. Its cargo was never officially documented, but the submarine rode unusually low in the water, according to witnesses at the Norwegian port. U-534 surrendered to Allied forces weeks later in the Atlantic, but by then, its cargo holds were empty. The crew maintained absolute silence about what they had transported, a silence that survived decades of interrogation and historical investigation. Operation Paperclip looms over this mystery, like a shadow. The official story of Paperclip is well known. America recruited German scientists and engineers, bringing them to the United States to leverage their expertise in rocketry, aviation, and other fields. Wernher von Braun and his team became the public face of this program. Their transition from Nazi V-weapons to American moon rockets, a narrative of redemption and Cold War pragmatism. But Paperclip was larger and darker than the public narrative suggested. Hundreds of Germans were brought to America under its auspices, their Nazi Party memberships quietly scrubbed from official records, their wartime activities reframed as mere technical work divorced from ideology. If the United States was willing to overlook the past of scientists who had worked slave laborers to death building V-2 rockets, would they have hesitated to acquire Die Glocke? The circumstantial evidence builds like a storm cloud. Several scientists associated with the Bell Project appear in Paperclip records, though their specialties are listed vaguely, their specific wartime work classified at levels that remain sealed even today. Transportation manifests show unexplained shipments of heavy equipment arriving at Wright Field in Ohio, the center of American aerospace research, in the summer of 1945 time. A 1946 report from Wright Field, partially declassified in the 1990s, mentions research into unconventional propulsion systems and field effects, terminology that echoes the fragmentary descriptions of Die Glocke's operation. The report notes that the research built on German wartime work, but the specific projects remain redacted, black bars of ink concealing whatever details the government continues to consider sensitive more than 70 years later. Perhaps most intriguingly, there are reports of a specialized facility constructed at Wright Field in late 1945, a heavily reinforced underground testing chamber built to specifications that included unusual electromagnetic shielding and radiation containment. The official explanation for this facility was research into atomic effects, but the design details don't quite match what would be needed for nuclear weapons testing. The chamber's dimensions, preserved in partially released construction documents, are provocatively similar to descriptions of Die Glocke's test chamber in Poland. The timeline aligns with suspicious precision. The Bell vanishes from Poland in April 1945. Unexplained heavy cargo moves through various routes in May. By June, American intelligence officers are conducting intensive interrogations of German scientists, asking detailed questions about unconventional physics research. By autumn, construction begins on specialized facilities at American research centers, facilities whose purpose remains classified. Yet for all this circumstantial evidence, definitive proof remains elusive. No photograph of Die Glocke in American hands has ever surfaced. No scientist has come forward with a deathbed confession about working on the Bell in Ohio or New Mexico. The documents that might confirm or deny the theory remain locked in archives, still classified under national security provisions. This absence of proof is itself suggestive. The American government has declassified enormous amounts of material about other aspects of Nazi scientific research. We know in exhaustive detail about V-2 rockets, jet engines, even chemical and biological weapons programs. But around Die Glocke, around the specific experiments conducted in Lower Silesia, around the fate of certain scientists and certain shipments in spring 1945, there remains a wall of official silence. The murder of 62 scientists speaks to the importance of what they knew. You don't execute that many people to protect a secret that doesn't matter. You don't kill the very experts who could rebuild or explain your advanced technology, unless that technology is so significant, so potentially revolutionary, that its secrets are worth more than their lives. Those men died in an unmarked clearing, their knowledge scattered into oblivion. But did their creation die with them? Or did it merely change hands, transported from a collapsing Reich to a rising superpower? Did the Bell's strange hum fall silent in the polished forests, or did it resume in American laboratories, its secrets now jealously guarded by a new set of masters? The questions echo through the decades, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. All we know with certainty is that something terribly important vanished in those final days, important enough to kill for, important enough to lie about, important enough to keep classified long after everyone directly involved has turned to dust. December 9th, 1965 began as an ordinary winter evening in western Pennsylvania. But before midnight, thousands of people across multiple states would witness something that would transform the quiet town of Kecksburg into the center of one of the most disturbing mysteries in American history. What makes this incident particularly terrifying is not merely the crash itself, but the possibility that what fell from the sky that night was not extraterrestrial at all. Instead, it may have been something far more sinister, a Nazi superweapon that had somehow traveled through time and space to reappear 20 years after the end of World War II. The first reports came in around 4:45 in the evening, as the winter sun was setting across the Great Lakes region. Witnesses from Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania reported seeing a brilliant fireball streaking across the darkening sky, leaving a thick trail of smoke and debris in its wake. The object moved with purpose, not like a meteor burning up on entry, but like something under intelligent control, making deliberate course corrections as it descended through the atmosphere. Frances Kalp was doing dishes in her farmhouse kitchen just outside Kecksburg when she heard what sounded like a sonic boom rattling her windows. She ran outside to see a column of blue-white smoke rising from the woods about a mile from her property. The smoke had an unusual quality to it. She would later tell reporters it seemed to shimmer and pulse with an inner light, and it had a peculiar smell that reminded her of burning electrical equipment mixed with something she could not quite identify. Something metallic and wrong. Something metallic and wrong. Within minutes, dozens of local residents began making their way toward the crash site. The woods in that area were familiar territory to most of them, hunting grounds and childhood playgrounds, but what they encountered that evening would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives. Several witnesses managed to reach the impact zone before authorities arrived, and their accounts remain remarkably consistent even decades later. John Murphy, a reporter for radio station WWII, was one of the first on the scene. He began interviewing witnesses immediately, capturing their raw, unfiltered reactions on tape. Those who got closest to the object described it as roughly bell-shaped or acorn-shaped, about 12 feet long and perhaps 9 feet in diameter at its widest point. The surface appeared to be made of a dull, bronze-colored metal that seemed incredibly smooth, almost seamless. But what disturbed witnesses most were the markings. Around the base of the object, just above what appeared to be a raised ridge or bumper, ran a band of symbols that looked nothing like any alphabet the witnesses recognized. The characters were geometric and precise, reminiscent of hieroglyphics but distinctly different from Egyptian writing. Some witnesses described them as resembling ancient runes, while others said they looked almost technological, like circuit diagrams rendered in an unknown language. These descriptions would later send chills through researchers familiar with Die Glocke, the Nazi bell device reportedly covered in similar strange symbols. Bill Bulebush, a firefighter who responded to the initial reports, later described an overwhelming sense of dread as he approached the object. He made it to within 50 feet before experiencing sudden, violent nausea that forced him to retreat. Other witnesses reported similar physical effects: splitting headaches that came on instantaneously, a metallic taste in their mouths, and a strange tingling sensation that spread across their skin like electricity. Some said they felt an inexplicable terror, a primal fear that had no rational source, as if the object itself radiated wrongness. Then the military arrived, and everything changed. According to multiple witnesses, trucks began appearing within 2 to 3 hours of the crash, far too quickly for a routine response to a reported meteor. These were not local National Guard units or state police. The vehicles were unmarked, and the personnel who emerged wore no identifying insignia, though their movements and organization were unmistakably military. They established a perimeter around the crash site with startling efficiency, cordoning off the entire area and ordering all civilians to leave immediately. Witnesses described a scene of intense, focused activity. Powerful floodlights were erected, bathing the woods in harsh white light despite the late hour. Radio chatter filled the air, though those who overheard it said much of the communication was in technical terminology they could not understand. The soldiers, if that is what they were, worked with urgent precision, as if they knew exactly what they were dealing with and exactly how dangerous it might be. The most chilling accounts come from those who observed the removal operation. Late that night, several residents positioned themselves at vantage points overlooking the main road leading out of Kecksburg. They watched as a large flatbed truck emerged from the access road to the woods, moving slowly and deliberately. On the bed of the truck sat an object covered by a heavy tarpaulin, but the shape beneath was clearly visible, bell-shaped or acorn-shaped, roughly 12 feet long. Bonnie Mills-Legel watched the truck pass her position and later reported that armed guards rode alongside it, and the entire convoy moved with an air of extreme urgency and secrecy. The truck did not stop at any local facility. It proceeded directly to Lockbourne Air Force Base in Ohio, according to witnesses who followed it as far as they could. After that, the trail went cold. Meanwhile, back in Kecksburg, something even more disturbing was unfolding. Radio reporter John Murphy had collected hours of witness testimony and had even managed to photograph some of the military activity. He returned to the station excited to break what he believed would be the biggest story of his career. But when he arrived, military personnel were waiting for him. According to colleagues who were present, the men confiscated Murphy's photographs and tape recordings, warned him in no uncertain terms to cease his investigation, and left with all physical evidence of the incident. Murphy was never the same after that night. Colleagues said he became withdrawn and nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder. He continued working as a reporter but never again mentioned the Kecksburg incident publicly. In 1969, just 4 years after the crash, John Murphy died under circumstances his family considered suspicious, though the official cause was listed as natural. The timing seemed particularly cruel, as he had just begun privately discussing the possibility of reopening his investigation. The physical effects on witnesses who got close to the object became more apparent in the days and weeks following the incident. Several people reported persistent nausea and headaches that lasted for months. Others described strange burns on their skin that appeared days after their exposure, circular patterns that doctors could not explain and could not successfully treat. Some witnesses experienced significant memory loss, finding gaps in their recollection of that evening that troubled them deeply. Most disturbing were the long-term health consequences. An unusually high number of people who were present at the crash site that night later developed rare cancers and blood disorders. While it is impossible to prove a direct causal link, the statistical cluster was striking enough that researchers have noted it repeatedly. Several key witnesses died young, their deaths attributed to various illnesses that seemed to emerge from nowhere and progress with alarming speed. Then there were those who simply disappeared. At least 3 individuals who claimed to have gotten very close to the object vanished in the years following the incident. Their families filed missing persons reports, but investigations led nowhere. In one case, a witness named Stan Gordon, who had been particularly vocal about what he saw, left his house one morning to buy groceries and never returned. His car was found abandoned 3 states away, empty and locked. He has never been seen or heard from again. The specifications of the object witnessed at Kecksburg match descriptions of Die Glocke with unsettling precision. The Nazi bell was reportedly bell or acorn-shaped, approximately 9 to 12 feet in height, covered in a hard, ceramic-like metallic shell with a bronze or copper coloring. It featured strange symbols that witnesses described as hieroglyphic or runic in nature. The device allegedly produced severe physical effects on those exposed to it, including nausea, vertigo, metallic taste, and a sense of dread, the exact symptoms reported by Kecksburg witnesses. Die Glocke was said to have been tested in a specially constructed facility in Lower Silesia, in what is now Poland, under the direction of SS General Hans Kammler. The device was part of a classified program whose purpose remains unclear, though theories range from exotic propulsion systems to time manipulation experiments. Several scientists working on the project reportedly died from exposure to whatever energies the bell produced, developing symptoms eerily similar to radiation poisoning. When Allied forces closed in on Nazi Germany in early 1945, Die Glocke vanished. General Kammler, one of the most powerful men in the SS hierarchy, disappeared as well and was never captured or accounted for. Researchers have long speculated about what became of the bell. Some believe it was destroyed to prevent capture. Others think it was smuggled out of Germany, perhaps to South America. But a more terrifying theory suggests that the final test of Die Glocke succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, that the device did not simply move through space, but through time itself. Could the object that crashed in Kecksburg have been the same device tested in Nazi Germany 20 years earlier? The timeline is impossible yet compelling. If Die Glocke's purpose involved temporal manipulation, if the Nazis had somehow stumbled upon technologies that allowed movement through time, the bell might have been launched or activated in 1945, only to reappear in 1965, traveling through 20 years in an instant. This would explain the military's immediate and overwhelming response. If American intelligence had information about Die Glocke, if they knew what it was and what it represented, the urgency makes perfect sense. This was not an extraterrestrial craft that required study and analysis. This was a known quantity, a weapon system developed by an enemy regime, technology that the United States government would absolutely want to secure and conceal. The official explanation offered by the government stands as one of the most implausible cover stories in the history of UFO incidents. Initially, authorities claimed that nothing had crashed at all, that witnesses had simply seen a meteor burning up in the atmosphere. When the volume of testimony and physical evidence made this story untenable, they revised their statement, claiming that a meteorite had indeed fallen but had been recovered and found to be nothing unusual. This explanation crumbled under the weight of its own inconsistencies. Meteors do not make controlled descents. They do not have geometric symbols inscribed on their surfaces. They do not cause military mobilizations within hours. And most certainly, they do not require flatbed trucks and armed escorts for transportation to secure military facilities. In subsequent years, various government agencies offered different explanations. One account suggested the object was a Soviet satellite that had fallen from orbit. Another claimed it was debris from an American space program test. Each news story contradicted the last, and none addressed the eyewitness testimony describing the object's appearance and the strange physical effects it produced. Perhaps most tellingly, when researchers filed Freedom of Information Act requests seeking documentation of the incident, they encountered unprecedented resistance. Documents were heavily redacted. Entire files were declared lost or destroyed. In 2005, a NASA official stated that records of the incident had been misplaced. An astounding claim given the agency's typically meticulous documentation practices. The suppression of physical evidence was absolute and thorough. Not a single photograph from that night has ever surfaced publicly. The tape recordings made by John Murphy are gone, confiscated, and never returned. Soil samples collected by civilians from the impact site mysteriously disappeared from testing facilities. Even the tree damaged by the object's descent, which several witnesses specifically marked and photographed, was cut down and removed within weeks of the incident, officially to clear a firebreak. Today, Kecksburg has embraced its place in UFO history, erecting a large replica described by witnesses in the center of town. It serves as a tourist attraction and a monument to an unexplained event. But for those who were there that December evening, for the witnesses who saw the object and felt its effects, for the families of those who suffered illness or disappeared, the acorn-shaped replica is a reminder of something far more sinister than a simple UFO encounter. It represents the possibility that the most dangerous weapons of the Third Reich did not die with Hitler's regime, that technologies we barely understand were created in the desperate final days of World War II, and that at least one of these devices somehow survived, traveling through time and space to crash in a small Pennsylvania town on a cold winter night? And if that is true, then the question that haunts researchers to this day becomes unavoidable. If Die Glocke appeared once in 1965, could it appear again? And what other Nazi superweapons might still be out there, lost in time, waiting to re-emerge when we least expect them? And 80 years after the end of World War II, there are questions that refuse to die. Questions that linger in the shadows of history, whispered in the corridors of academic conferences and classified briefings alike. Among all the dark technologies that emerged from the Nazi regime, one stands apart in its complete defiance of explanation. Die Glocke, the bell. We know the stories. We have examined the witnesses. We have traced the paper trails and explored the ruins. And yet, the most fundamental questions remain unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. What exactly was Die Glocke designed to do? This seemingly simple question has confounded researchers for decades. The official explanations, if they ever existed, were either destroyed or remain locked away in archives that governments refuse to acknowledge. The device consumed enormous resources. It demanded the expertise of Germany's most brilliant physicists. It required a dedicated testing facility carved into the mountains of Lower Silesia. All of this for a machine whose purpose we can only guess at. Was it an anti-gravity propulsion system? A time manipulation device? An energy weapon that could tear through the fabric of space itself? The few surviving witnesses provided descriptions that seemed to contradict the known laws of physics, speaking of fields that made time behave strangely, of materials that aged years and seconds, of test subjects whose bodies were found with their cells destroyed at a molecular level. Then there is the question that haunts every investigator who has pursued this mystery. Where is Die Glocke now? The last confirmed sighting placed the device in the hands of SS General Hans Kammler in the final days of the war. Kammler himself vanished, his fate disputed by conflicting reports. Some say he died in Prague. Others claim he was secretly extracted by American intelligence. But what happened to his cargo? Did the Bell end up in the United States, seized as part of Operation Paperclip? Does it sit in a warehouse somewhere, its custodians afraid to activate it after reading the reports of what it did to its operators? Or did it fall into Soviet hands, carried eastward into the depths of Russia where it remains hidden even now? Some researchers suggest an even more disturbing possibility, that Die Glocke was never captured at all, that it was moved to a location prepared well in advance, waiting in some underground facility for a purpose we cannot fathom. The environmental evidence raises questions that science struggles to answer. Why do the areas around the Wenceslas mine remain damaged after all these decades? Vegetation grows differently there, twisted and stunted. The soil itself seems altered at a fundamental level. Conventional explanations point to industrial contamination, to the residue of chemical processes. But these explanations fail to account for the specific nature of the damage, for the way it seems to radiate outward from specific points and patterns that suggest something far stranger than simple pollution. Those who have investigated the site with radiation detectors report anomalies that come and go without pattern. Trees near the testing area grow in spiral patterns. Local wildlife avoids certain sections entirely, creating dead zones in otherwise thriving forests. These are not the signatures of conventional weapons testing or industrial runoff. Perhaps most disturbing are the deaths. Over the years, researchers who dug too deeply into the mystery of Die Glocke have met untimely ends. Some died in accidents that seem just random enough to avoid suspicion. Car crashes, falls from unexpected heights, heart attacks in individuals with no history of cardiac problems. Others simply disappeared, their investigations abandoned midstream, their notes and files scattered or seized. Coincidence? Surely. Researchers die. People have accidents. And yet the pattern persists, a shadow that falls over anyone who gets too close to something that someone, somewhere, desperately wants to keep hidden. Are these deaths truly random? Or is there an active effort to suppress knowledge of what the Bell really was? The possibility that haunts the edges of this mystery is perhaps the most unsettling. What if Die Glocke still exists, not as a museum piece or a historical curiosity, but as an active technology? What if somewhere, in a facility buried beneath the desert, or hidden in the mountains, or submerged beneath the ocean, the Bell waits? And what if those who possess it understand even less than we do about what it truly does? The Nazi scientists who built it worked from theories we can barely reconstruct. They followed paths of research that mainstream physics had abandoned or never explored. If the device survived, and if it has been activated, studied, tested in the decades since the war, what has been learned? What has been unleashed? There is a thought that keeps investigators awake at night, a possibility that refuses to be dismissed. What if the Nazis discovered something fundamental about the nature of reality itself? What if Die Glocke was not simply a weapon or a propulsion system, but a device that interacted with the deepest structures of space and time? The reports speak of reality distortion, of time flowing at different rates, of matter responding to forces we do not understand. These are not the effects of conventional technology, no matter how advanced. They suggest something far more profound and far more dangerous. What if the bell does not just destroy, but corrupts? What if its effects linger not because of radiation or chemical contamination, but because it fundamentally alters the nature of space itself in its vicinity? What if the reason the testing areas remain damaged is that the damage is not to the matter, but to the underlying structure of reality in those locations? This would explain why the effects persist, why they resist conventional cleanup efforts, why they manifest in ways that seem to defy causation. It would also mean that every activation of the device, every test, every experiment leaves a permanent scar on the fabric of existence. The truly terrifying implication is that humanity may not be ready for this knowledge. The Nazi scientists who worked on Die Glocke disappeared or died before they could fully document their discoveries. The theories they developed, the mathematics they used, the fundamental insights they achieved, all of this may have been lost or deliberately suppressed. And if it surfaces again, if researchers rediscover the principles that made the bell possible, will we have the wisdom to recognize the danger? Or will the promise of unlimited energy, of gravity control, of mastery over time itself prove too tempting to resist? Somewhere perhaps in a vault whose location is known to only a handful of people, Die Glocke waits in silence. Its metal surface still bears the marks of its last activation. The chamber around it still shows the strange discoloration that no one can quite explain. And those who guard it understand, on some level, that they are custodians of something that should never have been created, can never be safely studied, but also can never be destroyed for fear of what its destruction might unleash. The bell remains, a dark monument to human ambition, a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.